Behavioural economics on a post-it number 5. In this little video, I'm going to talk a little bit about prospect theory. I think I mentioned in the previous video, post-it note number 4, that prospect theory is what's called a descriptive theory that's been developed in behavioural economics. Descriptive theory describes how people, or describes how people do behave in reality, as opposed to how they ought to behave, which is a normative theory. Prospect theory was developed by two very famous psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, that some of you will have heard of. I think Kahneman probably has done more towards the development of behavioural economics over the last 50 years now. It's been working since the 1960s, so yeah, more than 50 years than anybody else. And obviously prospect theory was a profound contribution by both him and Amos Tversky. It was on the basis of the prospect theory that Kahneman won the Nobel Prize, I think, principally. And Tversky would have also won the Nobel Prize, but unfortunately he passed away before that prize was awarded. Anyway, I'm just going to say, prospect theory says lots of things, but I'm just going to point out two main things that I've summarised already in previous post-it notes. And that is that prospect theory makes two major modifications to rational choice theory. Prospect theory was initially developed in the late 1970s. Or initially published in the late 1970s. Now, the two main modifications are around probabilities and around outcomes. So if you remember, this is just summarising again what I talked about in previous post-it notes. So if I just grab my little marker here. So if you just ignore the bottom half of the post-it for a moment. This is again just a reiteration and a reminder of what probability weighting does. So in prospect theory, it's assumed that people don't subjectively process objective probabilities as they are given, right? But rather, so they don't necessarily process, say, a 0.1 probability as a 0.1 probability. They may overweight that probability. So prospect theory says that people will often overweight small probabilities and underweight large probabilities, with what's called an inflection point, where objective probability equals subjective probability, or vice versa, of around 0.4, give or take. Right? So that's the first major modification. Probabilities are not subjectively processed as they are objectively given, but people overweight small probabilities and underweight large probabilities. The second major modification that prospect theory makes to expected utility theory, or standard rational choice theory, or standard economic theory, is that the carriers of value are not assumed to be what people end up with. So in standard economics, standard rational choice theory, what you finally end up with is what counts. In prospect theory, the carriers of value for an individual tend to be what people can gain or lose, their losses and their gains balanced against each other, against what they already have. So this is the value function part, value function around outcomes. So if you remember, people are increasingly insensitive or decreasingly sensitive to mounting gains, but also decreasingly sensitive to mounting losses, which means that you have this concave value function in the domain of gains, which the origin is the reference point. Anything above the reference point is considered to be a gain. And you have this convex. I think in a previous post-it note I suggested that the loss the value function in the domain of losses was concave. I think I mentioned that's a mistake. It's actually convex. It's concave in the domain of gains and convex in the domain of losses, right? So the shape of these value functions implies that people will be risk averse, not very good today, am I? Risk averse in the domain of gains and risk seeking in the domain of losses when they face losses. And there's also this observation of loss aversion embedded into the value function, where you have a kink, what's called a kink at the origin. The value function is steeper towards the origin in the domain of losses than it is in the domain of gains. People care more about losing a particular amount, say losing £10, than they do about gaining £10, right? The magnitude of disutility is greater than the magnitude of utility for losing rather than gaining that same thing, right? Now, if you combine these two modifications together, you get quite an interesting pattern of predicted risk attitudes, right? And Kahneman himself, I think Kahneman wrote somewhere that he considered this pattern of risk attitudes to be the most important or distinctive implication of prospect theory. So if you just consider again outcomes, then as we've said, prospect theory predicts that people will be risk averse in the domain of gains and risk seeking in the domain of losses when they're faced with possible losses. But when you combine that with probability weighting, especially overweighting of small probabilities, we have a slightly more complex prediction of risk attitudes. Namely, if people overweight the small probability of gaining something, as they might do, say, in a lottery, then that might lead them from risk aversion to risk-seeking attitude, to liking risk in the domain of gains. And if people conversely overweight small probabilities of losses, then for small probability losses, that might lead people to demonstrate risk-averse behaviours in the domain of losses. Right? Risk-averse behaviours in the domain of losses when they're faced with small probability losses. So from that you get a pattern of risk attitudes that's called the reflection effect, and I'm going to devote a whole post-it later in the series to the reflection effect, so I won't talk about that in any more detail here. But in summary, these are the two main modifications: probability weighting and then increasing insensitivity or decreasing sensitivity to increasing gains and increasing losses around a reference point, with loss aversion embedded within that when considering people's psychological valuation of outcomes.